grade 11s, we're on to our last topic in financial maths, and that's topic 5, which is depreciation. Now, to be honest, depreciation is probably one of the topics. It's saved till last because it's completely separate and different to the others, but it's actually much easier than what we have been doing. If you do accounting, you'll probably be familiar with this term. So let's have a look. First of all, can we just define what depreciation is? Now, depreciation means the loss in value of generally an asset, really. Now, if you think about this, what is an asset? Well, an asset of a person could be their car or their computer or their furniture, anything like that. And most assets actually lose value. So cars lose value because of wear and tear. You use them, they get mileage, and so therefore they become worth less and less and less. Very few things increase in value with age. Some do. For example, property generally does. Some investments like art often appreciate in value. But when you're talking about assets like computers, equipment, vehicles, etc., they generally depreciate. Now, just like there's two types of interest, there's two types of depreciation. So let's consider the following two cases. Example 1. Fourways High School bought a van at a cost of 250,000 Rand. It depreciates at a rate of 20% per year on the cost price at the end of each year. Calculate the value of the van at the end of year 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, hopefully you'll realize that this sounds a lot like simple interest because it's depreciating at 20% of the cost every year. So at the end of year 1, if I find 20% of 250,000, I get 50,000 Rand. So basically, the value of the car, or the van in this case, at the end of year 1 is 250,000, take away 50,000, which is 200,000 Rand. Now that is actually called the book value. So you probably would have heard about this this term in cars. It's a book value. That basically it comes from the idea that what is the value on the books of that car, as in talking about financial accounting books. So the book value of this van at the end of the first year would be 200,000 Rand. Now, if it's depreciating at a rate of 20% each year on the cost price, that means at the end of the second year, it will lose another 50,000 Rand. Because I would have done the same calculation. It's 20% of the cost price every year. So it's exactly the same idea as simple interest. So then it would lose another 50,000 Rand. And at the end of year 4, it would lose another 50,000 Rand. So actually, if I continued on at the end of year 5, it would be worth nothing. Now, in reality, assets can never be worth nothing because you can always sell them off for scrap if it's a really, really, really old car. And so this isn't a particularly, the same as simple interest, it's not a particularly useful type of depreciation in the real world. In the real world, what we tend to use is case number 2. So exactly the same idea. They've got a van at a cost of 250,000 Rand and it depreciates at 20% of the current value of the van. Now that sounds a lot like compound interest, except it's kind of like compound depreciation. So at the end of year 1, I would have done exactly the same calculation. 20% of 250,000 Rand is 50,000 Rand. So what is the book value of the van? After year 1, it's 200,000 Rand. So exactly the same idea. However, in year 2, it's now going to be 200,000 Rand times 20% is what I will be losing. Now that's 40,000 Rand. So that means that this van is worth 160,000 Rand because I've taken the current value, subtracted my depreciation, and I've got 160,000 Rand. At the end of year 3, my depreciation is now going to be 20% of the current value. So 20% of 160,000 Rand, which is 32,000 Rand. So now the book value of my van is 160 minus 32,000 Rand, which is 128,000 Rand. Now, if you can just look at the difference in the values of the book value of the vans at the moment, when I'm using this compound depreciation, because my book value of my van is less and less each year, you'll notice my depreciation is becoming less and less each year. So in my final year, it's 128,000 times 20% for depreciation, and that is 25,600. And so finally, when I subtract that off, I get that the book value of my van is now 102,400 Rand. And again, you'll notice how much more my book value is on this type of depreciation. Now, the second case is what we generally use in the real world. So what are these two types of depreciation? I'm just going to write a note under here. This type of depreciation is called straight line depreciation. Now, it's called straight line depreciation because if you drew a graph of the book value of this van, this book value would have started at 200,000 Rand, and it would have decreased by the same amount each year, and eventually after 5 years we said it would be worth nothing. And because it's decreasing by the same amount each year, it's basically its gradient is constant, which means it forms a straight line. So it is called straight line depreciation. Whereas the second case, this is called depreciation on reducing balance, as in on the reduced amount every time. So you either say depreciation on reducing balance, or sometimes they say on diminishing balance. So another word for reducing is diminishing balance. Now, if you were to plot this book value, you don't get a straight line. Because yes, the car started at the same value and it lost 50,000, but then it loses less and less and less and less. And so it basically forms like a little bit of like a decreasing exponential. So its pattern looks a lot different. So almost in exactly the same way, we need to look at depreciation as almost having a simple depreciation, which is actually called straight line depreciation, and almost like a compound depreciation, which is depreciation on reducing balance. Now, what's wonderful is that both of these therefore have formulas, and it will be unsurprising to you that they're almost exactly the same as the simple and compound interest formula, except with a minus and not a plus, because you're not adding a certain percentage every year, you're subtracting a certain percentage every year. So literally, it's exactly the same formulas as compound and simple interest, but with a subtraction sign instead of an addition sign. Now, the good news about depreciation is always an annular thing. So there's no compounded monthly or anything like that. So that makes the questions a lot more simpler than the interest ones. Okay, so let's look at some examples about how to use these formulas. They are given to you on your formula sheet, and so you don't actually have to remember them. So Carl buys a computer at 25,000 Rand. Calculate its book value, so that's the word they used. That is basically the A value, the final value that it's worth after 3 years, if depreciation is on 10% on a straight line basis. So my straight line formula is exactly the same as the simple interest. In a way, it's 25,000. Instead of a plus, it's a minus, and it's 10%, and they said for 3 years. And that gives me 17,500 is the book value of my computer. Okay, so what happens if it was 10% on reducing balance? Now let's just try and predict, should it be worth more? Now it probably should be worth more after the same amount of time, simply because you are working out the depreciation on a smaller and smaller amount every year. And so I think your computer, if this was a computer, I think it was, will be worth more. So it's 10%, except it's almost like a compound depreciation, so it's to the power of 3. And so absolutely it's worth 18,225 Rand, which is slightly more than the straight line basis. Okay, so that's pretty much the formulas, and obviously we can solve for different things. And so let's look at another example. Example 3 says a mining company buys machinery to the value of 4 million Rand. They expect to replace this machinery after 4 years. Okay, now this is a very important concept that we're going to be looking at in this particular question. Unfortunately, equipment eventually becomes useless and you have to replace it. All computers, mining machinery, cars, anything that depreciates in value, it basically eventually gets so used that the computer stops turning on, or maybe it's so obsolete because it's so old, or the phone stops working. And so eventually you have to replace it. And so this example and the next one is going to be talking about replacing an asset. So let's look at the first question. It says, on reducing balance, can your asset ever be worth nothing? And this answer is no. Simply because you're always depreciating by a percentage of the current value. So if you're taking away a percentage of the current value, you must be left with something left over. It's not the same as straight line where you're just subtracting a constant amount every time. So the answer is no, because you always depreciate by a percentage on the current value, which means you must always be left with something. So therefore, you always have something left over. So if you depreciated by 10%, you would still have 90% left over. Now eventually that becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, but eventually, you'll never get to zero because you will always have 90% left over if you decreased by 10%. So you'll always have some value left over. So now this next question says, what annual rate of depreciation is used if they expected the machinery to be worth nothing after 4 years? Now, it can't be worth nothing because I'm sure they can sell it for scrap. But anyway, this must mean that it must be a straight line balance. It's the only way that you could be worth nothing. So how do I take, now be very careful here because I'm so used to putting the big numbers in for A. So something to be really careful of here is your P is always your A is always less than your P, because your final amount of depreciation is always going to be smaller because your asset has lost value. So if you start swapping them around, you start getting negative years and interest rates. So you'll figure out that you've done something wrong. Now this says after 4 years, so what interest rate was it? So if I divide by 4 million on both sides, I get 0. So 1 minus 4i. So I get 4i is 1. So if I divide by 4, I get 0.25, which is 25%. Now that makes sense because 25% would be a quarter of the value. So it loses a quarter of a value every year. So after 4 years on straight line, it would be worth nothing. Now the question says, the company decided to use reducing balance depreciation. What is the annual rate of depreciation if the machinery is worth 750,000 Rand after 4 years? So now I'm using my reducing balance, which is a slightly different formula. It is worth 750,000 Rand from 4 million, which has, just don't forget that million has 6 zeros. What interest rate is it? Depreciation rate is it if it's worth nothing after 4 years? So I would take my 750,000 and divide by 4 million. So you should get quite a small number. And I get 3 over 16, which I could change to decimal, which will probably be better. So I get 0.1875. And that equals 1 minus I to the power of 4. So I would now, we're getting used to this idea of rooting. So I would fourth root that. And I get 0.658037 blah 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 is 1 minus I. So I would probably bring my I to this side to make it positive and take that to that side. So I do 1 minus that answer. And now I get 0.34196. So I times by 100 to get a percentage, and my depreciation is 34,196. So don't forget that the 6 then rounds the 9, which rounds the 1. So actually I get 34,20 or just 2% per annum. Okay, so now that example was just about solving for something different in the formula. It shouldn't be very different to what we were doing in interest. It simply has a subtraction sign in the equation and not an addition sign. Okay, so let's do the one other thing which is new. And this is the idea what I was talking about replacing assets. So let's look at example 4. A farmer buys a tractor for 550,000 Rand. The tractor depreciates on reducing balance at a rate of 18% per annum. Inflation is 10.5%. Now, let's just quickly discuss what inflation is. This should be a word that's fairly common to you from about grade 9, But inflation is basically the increase in cost of all items. Everything in this country increases in cost. Petrol, electricity, food, water, everything increases in cost. And so every country has what's called inflation. And that's kind of an average annual rate by which exactly the same items will increase in cost compared to last year. So how Stats SA actually work out what inflation is in this country is they basically have a virtual basket, and they have, I think it's 500 odd items that are in this basket. Now obviously it's not a physical basket, so they take cars and they take, a certain brand of milk and a certain brand of rice, and they take a variety of items that people would buy, and they compare what is the total cost of all those items this year, and then what is the total cost of all those items next year, and what was the percentage increase, and that's called inflation. Now at the moment, inflation, people always say that they experience inflation at a higher rate than what it is. I think at the moment it's around 4.5%. We aim in this country to keep our inflation below 6%. But petrol increases by so much that often you feel like inflation is a lot more than it is. So inflation, the increase in cost of all items. So when this farmer buys a tractor, he has two things to consider. Number one, his tractor is busy driving around and losing value, so it's depreciating. But number two, if he wants to maybe replace this tractor in a couple of years' time, unfortunately this tractor is going to cost him more than 550,000 Rand, because everything increases in cost every year. So let's look at these questions. The first question says, calculate the book value of the tractor at the end of 4 years. So it was reducing balance. Please just be careful to always pick the right formula, because they're very strict. If you pick the wrong formula, they often stop marking. So 550,000 minus 18%, and for 4 years. Now, if you don't get a number smaller than 550,000, we definitely made a mistake, because this is depreciation. So I get a value that this tractor is worth just under half, 248,666 Rand, 97 cents. So it's pretty much lost half of its value in 4 years. Now this question says, at the end of each year, the farmer deposits 65,000 Rand into a sinking fund. Okay, now we need to discuss what a sinking fund is. The reality is this tractor will eventually stop working, and the farmer will have to replace it. Now this is true for all the computers we work on at school. It's true for all computers in a company. It's true for your car. Eventually it'll stop working and you have to replace it. Now for a business or a person, if this happens, I don't know, in 5 years' time, you've got to suddenly find a hell of a lot of money to replace this asset. Now for a business, you can't suddenly have an expense of R1 million. The business might not have the cash flow to deal with that. And so what businesses do is that they form something called a sinking fund. Now a sinking fund is basically a savings account. What they do is they decide that, okay, in 5 years' time we're going to replace this tractor, or in 4 years' time. Let me start saving every year so that when I do have to replace it, I have some savings to put towards replacing it. So I don't suddenly have this massive expense that I can't undertake. So each year I'm going to save towards replacing my asset. So that's what a sinking fund is. It's a savings account to save towards replacing an asset. Okay, now this is a very, very commonly asked question, and in matric we do it again. So a sinking fund, basically just a savings account, and every year or every month a company will set aside money, and they will eventually use that money to replace an asset, simply to avoid a massive expense at one time. So they kind of are dividing the expense over a number of years. So this question says, at the end of each year, this farmer decides to deposit 65,000 Rand into a sinking fund to replace the old tractor. The sinking fund starts 1 year after the tractor was bought, and the last deposit was made at the end of the 4th year. So what is a sinking fund? Well, now that I see my lovely question, I should have looked ahead. So basically a sinking fund, same as account to save towards replacing an asset. I could have written it there. How much money is in the sinking fund at the end of 4 years? If interest is 14% per annum compounded annually. Okay, so this is time period nothing. He's just bought the tractor. They say at the end of the first year, at the end of 1 year after, this farmer, I think he put in 65,000. So he added 65,000 rand into the account at the end of the first year. At the end of the second year, he added 65,000 rand. At the end of the third year, he added 65,000 rand. And they said his last deposit was at the end of 4 years. So basically he made 4 payments. Now we've just done timelines. So we should know that we can't add those 65,000s together until I find out what they're worth at the same time. So I need to find out what this 65,000 rand is worth at the end. So that would be 65,000 rand. My interest is 14% compounded annually, and that will be in the account for 1, 2, 3 years. Now let me look at my second installment. This 65,000 rand is in the account for 2 years. So I need to add on 65,000 rand that would stay in the account for 2 years. Then my next installment would only be in the account for 1 year. So it would only gain 1 year's worth of annual interest. And finally, my last 65,000 rand got no interest because at the end of 4 years they wanted to know how much was in his sinking fund. So basically this was just a little mini timeline for me to work out. And I get a value, if I add them up, of 319,874 rand and 36 cents. Now that's definitely not going to be enough to replace my tractor because my tractor costs 550,000 rand now. So in 4 years' time it's definitely going to cost even more. But at least it's going towards replacing it, so I won't have such a big expense. So what does the next question say? It says in 4 years' time, how much money will the farmer need in addition to the sinking fund to purchase a new tractor? Now here's the thing which I needed to have added into this question, so I'm going to add in now, and I'm going to say if he trades in his old tractor. So when you want to buy a new tractor, you have a couple of choices. He could keep his old tractor and just use it around the farm when he needs to, but what most people do is they will trade in their old vehicle, and by trade-in means that basically the whatever tractor company basically pays him the book value for the tractor. So this would happen in a car dealership as well. If you wanted to buy a new car, you often take in your old car and the dealership will give you the book value of the car. So we've got a couple of things to answer in this question. First question I need to ask myself is how much will a tractor cost? Then I'll worry about how much he actually has. So how much will a tractor cost after 4 years? And that means I need to deal with inflation. So I need to say inflation is always compound interest, not simple interest. So my tractor cost 550,000 rand now. I think that says 550,000 rand. So let me check what my inflation rate was. So 550,000 rand now, inflation is 10.5%, which isn't too realistic because that's a bit high, but anyway. So 10.5% at the end of 4 years. Now, it's compound interest is quite frightening. So it'll be quite frightening to you to realize what that would cost him in 4 years' time. And that amount is 819,996 rand, 1278. So that's a huge increase. And unfortunately, that is the reality of compound interest. The second thing I have to ask myself is how much money has he saved? And that's my sinking fund, because that's what that's the whole point of a sinking fund, is to save up towards the cost. So my sinking fund that I got was this 319,874.36. So if I go back down to answer that question, he has saved 319,874 rand and 36 cents. So he doesn't need all of that 819,000 because he has saved. And my third question is, does he get any money for a trade-in? Now, I forgot to write it in then, so I added in, he did trade in his old tractor. So his trade-in value is the book value that he got. So I need to go look. That was about half the value of 550,000. So I got, if I went up and had a look, and that's 248,666 rand and 97 cents. So basically now I need to say to myself, he needs 819,996 rand, but he's saved 319,000 odd rand, and they're going to give him this book value. So how much money extra does he need? So that's my cost of my tractor. Subtract his savings of his sinking fund, and then subtract the book value. So he won't have nearly such a big expense as we would have expected when we first did that calculation. So if I did that correctly, he actually only needs 251,424 rand, 797. So this 80. So even though the tractor cost him 800,000 rand now, because he's made provision to save towards this in what's called a sinking fund, and he's got the trade in, it means he only needs about 250,000 rand. So he probably could have saved a bit better to make that maybe a little bit less of a lump sum, but this is basically how it would work in a real business. Now that's pretty much all we need to know for depreciation, because they're fairly simple formulas. It's quite a nice topic, but these sinking funds are a great way to include compound interest and a timeline and some depreciation. So they're quite commonly asked. And that is the last topic of financial maths.